Hey guys, Jeremy here from mensagaming.net, bringing you kind of an end of season review, list review video for this 2017 ITC season. We obviously just had both events wrap up. We had the LVO over in Las Vegas, which was kind of like the international finale for 40K. And of course, in Australia, we had Cancon, which is a brilliant event. It's been going for a long time, and it's a very much a staple kind of convention here in Australia. And they lined up on the exact same weekends this year. So we kind of had the grand final for each of those kind of regions occurring in the same weekend. And what was interesting is that very similar lists won both events. And I did go back to back this year and win Cancon with a Ynnari list that was eerily similar to the list, well, obviously Nick Nanavati's, but other people that were running the same event that had a lot of success in the United States. And it's also worth noting that Jeremy Young from Overwatch Wargaming also brought a list almost identical to mine to Cancon as well. So I guess the similar idea here is that lots of people were converging on this kind of this list, this formula that was very effective over multiple metagames, multiple regions. So I don't necessarily think any single person can or should take credit for that list, given that lots of people came up with it. But what's interesting is that why did they come up with it? Why did different people come up with that list? So there's a few questions I kind of want to answer today, or we'll go through. I've had a few people message me and kind of say, well, why did you put this in your list? How are you using this unit? Why was this successful? Why do you think the people in the United States did it? And I kind of rather than answer all these people separately, I thought I would kind of do a video, which I've done in the past. I'll try to keep this one shorter than my videos in the past. Rather than like a multi-part video, I'll try to keep this just to that one single video. So what kind of questions am I going to try to answer? I'm going to try to answer, why did this list fit a multi-event formula? Why did lots of people take this list? So, I guess that kind of follows into that second question of what makes it strong. Why is it challenging to play? So what are some intricacies of the list? What are some difficulties you might have if you're kind of learning this list and you're not having the success that you think it should have? And lastly, how should this list change? And I'm almost specifically talking about the kind of balance changes, updates, nerfs, whatever you want to call them, that GW will, I'm sure, implement regarding Ynnari and a couple of specific Craftwell units. How should they change, in my opinion? So let's have a look at the list to start with. So of course, I've spelled Alaitoc the wrong way here the whole way through, so I'm just going to change that now. So I've got the Alaitoc battalion. I've mixed Alaitoc and Ynnari as the other lists did. So I'll just go through from the start. So we had, I've got the two Spirit Seers, of course, because of the runes of battle powers are so strong. And Spirit Seers are a good value compared to their Warlock brothers. Just for that 10 points more, you get 2 extra wounds and the ability to cast a full strength smite. So given how important kill points are and losing, getting more kills or stopping your units from being killed, those 2 wounds are very important in the case of snipers or perils or things like that. And the smites are handy as well. We've got the Warlock Conclave. That's there almost exclusively to be able to cast the power that doubles the range. So it effectively allows you to cast Jinx with rather than an 18-inch range, a 36-inch range. So that's why you've got the Conclave there. 3 units of ranges. My units of ranges I took a little bit larger than the units of 5. I did this primarily to play around kind of them getting killed. I wanted to make it very difficult for my units to die, and I thought that pushing the range count up to 7 would make it more difficult for them to just die to a couple of errant smites, or just, that lucky last dude dying to shooting. I thought by having them at that extra threshold, it protected them, and it certainly did throughout the games. It's also very important in that it does allow you to create a larger screen. So, you do, by having the large, obviously more amount, you can string out more and screen more effectively. I've got the 2 Serpents, the 2 Wave Serpents with the Vectored Engines. I've got the Vectored Engines so that when you fire and fade your Dark Reapers into the Serpents, you can have a kind of a passive -2 to hit on them, which is very powerful. I've got a unit of 8 Dark Reapers in this Alaitoc battalion with a Tempest Launcher. It's worth noting that the American version of the list had, instead of having this unit of 8 Dark Reapers, they had a heavy support detachment with the 3 units of 3 Dark Reapers with Tempest Launchers. So there's obviously a little bit of a divergence there. I can certainly see the merits of having the MSU version. It allows you to have more Tempest Launchers, which are very powerful weapons. My version is obviously, I feel more confident with my version being able to kind of sit in on ruins and stuff or cover that's not necessarily out of line of sight, and kind of shoot and be willing to take fire back without necessarily losing the unit straight away, with obviously the -1 to hit from the Alaitoc craft world bonus. Then we move down to the Ynnari battalion. Obviously, you got your Farseer there. You've got Yvrane, who's phenomenal. I've got the 2 units of Dire Avengers, which kind of like, they're kind of just like to fill out the battalion. And they're also powerful or useful backfield units for scoring and kind of like blocking deep strikes. The American version of the list just used dark, what are they called? Cabalite Warriors from Dark Eldar to do the same thing. I liked having the Dire Avengers because it meant that they could board the transport at the start of the game. So at the start of the game, I had Dire Avengers and characters in one transport, and then my Dark Reapers in another transport, which really limited my drops. So I feel like I had a lot less drops in the American version of the list, which for me, I felt that was relevant, but I can also see the merits of taking much cheaper Cabalite Warriors, which I think come in at 7 points each, whereas the Dire Avengers are 12 points each. So there is a difference there. I got the 19 Guardians. They are Ulthway for be able to use the Black Guardian stratagem if I do want to keep them in Deep Strike. But often they just deployed on the board as a screen as well. So I felt having them as Ulthway was powerful just for that flexibility. It also meant that my opponent, when they read my list, had to be wary of that. So it kind of was a bit of a mind game as well. And then lastly, in the Ynnari detachment, I had a unit of 10 Dark Reapers with the Tempest Launcher, of course, and then the 9 Shining Spears. And of course, whenever the chapter tactics, the craft world bonus wasn't relevant, they kind of diverted back to Alaitoc to be able to board transports, etc. But in the case of things such as the Guardians, which weren't going to board a transport, or the Shining Spears, of course the Shining Spears are Same Han, but because they get that amazing stratagem that Same Han has. So that's the list. Many people would have seen it. It's very similar to the American versions. It's very similar to Jeremy Young's version. So there are little minutiae within that list that you could change. And depending on your own personal preferences, I don't see really anything that... Of course, there are those fundamental things like the Shining Spears and Yvrane and the Reapers and stuff and the transports. But there are small little things that you could change depending on flavor. Now moving back to my questions. The first question is, why did this fit multi-event formula and what makes it strong? I'll just kind of answer them together. So I feel like... what makes it strong in a multi-event formula was the fact that this list, as well as I'm sure the LVO lists, were crafted for those missions. Very specific ITC mission pack that was, I think, a fantastic missions. And I won't go into too much detail about my opinion on the missions, but based on the idea that we're playing with those missions, this list was crafted to be able to deal with those. And fundamentally, it needed to be able to score points. So it needed to have the ability to reach out, kill things, be able to kill things quickly when it needed to, especially to be able to score points such as like the Death by 1,000 Cuts secondary, where you really need to be able to ensure you can score like between thresholds of 3, so kill 3 or 6 units or whatever. And then also to deny people from killing you. So when I was kind of sitting down and working out how I wanted to tackle the missions, I felt that I wanted to be able to kill things. I wanted to be able to prevent my opponent from killing things to make sure that I was getting that kill more primary point at the end of the battle round. So I felt like that was going to be a really important point because it's a 2-point swing. Not only is it a 2-point swing, but it kind of makes sense on the battlefield to try to kill more and deny your opponent. So not only does it make sense in terms of getting an advantage on the battlefield and just killing your opponent, it also is translating that into direct points. So I really wanted to endeavor to make the army as hard to kill as possible. That's why you'll notice I took large units. I took very few kind of small units where I could avoid it. I also kind of wanted to make it so that my units got extra protection from things such as the Wave Serpents with, of course, the Vectored Engine's help. But just being able to fire and fade Dark Reapers into a Wave Serpent is a fantastic strategy. Of course, there's a bit of ambiguity. Some people are kind of saying they don't like the way that was ruled, but I kind of felt that that's the way it was going to be ruled, and that's the way in which the ITC were kind of pushing towards it with the judging. So I was quite happy to kind of like invest in that strategy. What else makes it strong? I think this list, a lot of people look at it and say, well, okay, everything kind of makes sense from, you've got lots of cool powers, you've got the ability to screen and all those things, but how do you kill your opponent? Almost all my games were ending in concedes on, or my opponent kind of saying, all right, well, I'm happy at this stage to concede defeat at around the turn 3 to turn 4 mark. So normally I was delivering crushing blows on turn 2 and 3. And how was I achieving that? Primarily, the answer is through the Soul Bursting Dark Reapers and through the Shining Spears. Those two units were almost single-handedly the focus point of this unit, of this army's damage. Of course, there are supporting units like the other Dark Reapers. In the case of Nick Nanavati's list, he had the small MSU Tempest launchers. My list has that secondary unit. And then you've got other kind of supporting elements as well, such as you might have things like your Guardians doing a bit of work. You might have, some Wave Serpents pushing forward, holding objectives, things like that. The Rangers can deliver a bit of damage if needed, but I can't stress enough how much the MVPs for this list were the big unit of Dark Reapers and, of course, the Shining Spears. So, and before I kind of go into those units individually, I will say, just as an extension of my first point, regarding the denying primaries being a powerful thing, I also made sure this list denied secondaries. It's really hard to pick secondary objectives versus this army. Kind of picking what are you going to pick? Well, there's only 2 vehicles in the army. There's only 2 units with 10 or more models, so you could only get the Reaper with the Dark Reapers, which I'm protecting, going all in to protect them, and the Guardians. So most people kind of were picking those kind of very abstract objectives, such as like they might go the old school objective, they might go the recon and things like that, which are not high scoring objectives. You can't create a flurry of points with those. And a lot of those points, often it was almost very difficult for my opponent to ever cap the full 4. If they start to get tabled, for example, they start to lose models, recon becomes a lot harder to score. So does things like Slay the Warlord point from old school, etc., etc. So my opponents were really struggling to work out how to pick secondaries versus this, which is a fundamental strength of this list. So now moving into those all-star units, we all know that Dark Reapers are really strong. Why does that unit of 10 Alaitoc Reapers from Ynnari, why are they so strong? Well, most of you already know, they start the game in reserve. You almost always use your 3 CP points to deep strike 2 units. And almost exclusively for me, those units were of course, my Reapers and my Shining Spears. Sometimes you don't need to deep strike the Shining Spears because you can deploy them so far back and screen them and protect them from relevant firepower. And you can save the 2 CP when you can. But almost always I was deep striking those 2 units. So the Dark Reapers start in deep strike reserve. They come down. You've ranged Soul Bursts them to shoot. They shoot again in the shooting phase with guide. Of course, I use my Farseer to try to guide them. So they're getting double volley from guide. And then they use Fire and Fade after they shoot in the shooting phase to to board a Serpent. That Wave Serpent advanced in the shooting phase, so it's -1 to hit from vectored engines. So you create this situation when the deep strike, the Reapers come down, shoot twice, so you're getting 18 missile shots and 2 volleys of 2d6 shots from the Tempest launchers. So 4d6 shots of Tempest launchers plus 18 missiles, all with rerolls, and all automatically hitting on 3s, even against modifiers. So this is insane firepower here, with the flexibility of being able to shoot the single or double shot mode, so you can kind of mix and match depending on what you need. And then they board a Serpent that's, 13 wounds, -2 to hit with 6 up F&P. It's insane survivability on that unit. So that was a very powerful unit that then in the next turn comes out and shoots again and double shoots again. So you can see how that could start to snowball games. And then the Shining Spears, they can start in reserve. They come down. You cast lots of psychic powers on them, and because they've got such high movement when you use your quicken power on them, it means you can deploy them in range so that your casters can cast buffs on them without your opponent being in deny range. So these Shining Spears are receiving a lot of psychic power buffs without your opponent necessarily being able to interact with that, even if they do have aggressive pushing characters like Magnus. Even if your opponent pushes a Magnus forward, you can still move your kind of Warlocks and Spirit Seers away from Magnus, getting them outside of deny range, and still be within 18 of a trailed back Shining Spear. So you buff them up, you try to give them +1 armor, you can give them Conceal as well if you feel like you need it, you can cast Fortune on them if that's relevant. So the 3 powers that you kind of want your Farseer to be thinking about taking are Guide, Fortune, and Doom. So depending on the game, you kind of choose whether you want which 2 of those 3 you want. Doom is really powerful when it's relevant, but Fortune's also really good on on the Shining Spears. I took Guide every game just because I felt like Guide was a very necessary force multiplier on my unit of 10 Dark Reapers, but I could certainly understand some players kind of saying in certain games, Guide isn't so relevant this game because it's actually my Shining Spears that are going to win me the game. So you leave Guide and then you take Fortune and Doom for your Shining Spears interactions. So you buff your Shining Spears with a few psychic powers, you quicken them forward, and when they advance with their movement, you pop the Simhan stratagem, which allows them to advance and charge. So you're getting a 22-inch move out of quicken, and if they're deployed on the board, they can move that twice. So they're going to get a 44-inch move, and that is obviously extremely strong. It allows them to jump over screens, and of course, because they have the fly keyword, they can charge over screens as well. So they've got immense flexibility when they're moving around, and then they're very killy in combat as well, but they're also really good at shooting. They shoot a ton of shots. They lose nothing from just a regular Wind Rider. They only gain things on top of the Wind Rider. So they gain the Laser Lance for shooting in combat, and they've got that amazing flexibility with the invuln save to shooting. They're just a really flexible unit, and then they are hit very hard in combat. And with the Ynnari kind of bonus, they get to Soul Burst in combat as well to deliver that extra volley of attacks. If you fail Quicken, you've got the flexibility to Soul Burst with your Vrain. Instead of Soul Bursting your Reapers, you can get that movement out of the Soul Burst. So there's just immense kind of flexibility and ability to, and you can call it redundancy, so that if something fails, something else will pick up the slack of the thing that didn't work. So that certainly applies with the Shining Spears and with the Dark Reapers, and they were doing amazing. Like there were certain games where, for example, you might take like the what's it called? The secondary to kill characters, and then your Shining Spears just jump into a pool, like a cluster of characters, and just max that straight away just from that one combat phase. So you've got the ability to really generate these massive windfalls of points. So that's why I think that it's such a strong list, and that's why I think different people were converging on it. Also because of the way in which the Ynnari nerfs occurred. People obviously that the way that the GW kind of FAQ'd Ynnari, they made it so you could only soul burst once per turn per type of soul burst. So the obvious, and it's not like I'm not taking any personal credit for this, but the obvious revelation is, well, I want to soul burst once really effectively from shooting. I want to soul burst once really effectively from combat, or I want to soul burst really effectively from movement. So the unit of Dark Reapers and the unit of Shining Spears kind of makes the most of those three things. The Dark Reapers get the ability to shoot. They've got the best kind of single unit worth of shooting in the army, and the Shining Spears have the best single unit worth of combat, or single unit worth of they can move, and they could also make the most of the shooting soul burst as well if they really want to, if you feel like you'd rather kind of shoot lots of shots rather than the missiles. So there's a ton of flexibility there. They're also really well costed units. They're obviously, we know they're really good points effectiveness. So that's why I think it's a strong army. That's kind of how I used it. And a lot of that kind of is common sense, but there are some synergies there that people might not immediately seize upon. So to move on to the next point, which is the question was, why is it challenging to play? I think it's challenging to play because this list, the battle plan adapts based on who you're versing and how the game is flowing. So, for example, you need to be able to have the flexibility to say, well, I just failed my Soul Burst, or I just failed my Quicken power on my Shining Spears. Do I want to Soul Burst them with your Vrain, or do I want to Soul Burst the Dark Reapers to shoot? You need to be able to make that assessment in your head and come up with contingency plans. It's also really very CP hungry, this list. My list only had the double battalion bonus, so I only had 9 CP. The American versions of the list had 10 CP because they had the additional detachment. Regardless of whether you got 9 or 10, there's a lot of CP you want to be using. You want to be using CP to support your psychic powers, not only through popping stratagems to increase range, to add +1 via Seer Council, but you also want to be able to reroll a dice in the psychic phase potentially. You need to pop CP for the Simhan stratagem off very often. You also want to be able to fire and fade. You also want to be able to, I think it's lightning reflexes. I'm not sure exactly what the stratagem is. 2 CP to make a unit -1 to hit in your opponent's shooting phase. That's extremely powerful. So you've got to kind of like petition off your CP and work out what CP in the pool of like must-haves. So that changes from game to game. In some games, you don't need the Saimhan CP because you might not need to move as far. In other games, you might not need the CP for lightning reflexes because you're not expecting your opponent to have much in the shooting phase. In other games, there'll be really kind of like CP that are very unique to your opponent, such as the forewarning stratagem to intercept. That's not always necessarily super powerful, but in some games it is. So you need to be able to say, okay, in this game, I need to petition those 2 CP for my opponent's turn 2 or turn 1 or whatever it might be. So working out how you're going to spend CP is actually very challenging, and it's very easy to make mistakes with that. How else is the list challenging? Well, it's challenging as well because Eldar are, despite the synergies that occur, Eldar are, at the end of the day, pretty easy to kill. They are very low toughness and have relatively weak armor saves. So if you, for whatever reason, get caught in combat with your Dark Reapers get assaulted for some reason, they're going to die very easily in assault. And similar applies to the Shining Spears. While the Shining Spears on the offense are extremely, they put out a lot of damage, they can soul burst, they've got that extra bonus from charging. When they get assaulted, they lose their invuln save to shooting. They are just toughness for, models with a 3-up save. They're just Marines, really, in combat. They get hit pretty hard. So at the end of the day, you've got to kind of work out how you're going to protect them via positioning and also via kind of killing the things that can hurt them. So target priority and movement and board space use is very important in keeping your army alive. So it is challenging, but there are very powerful tools you're using and that are supporting you with this army. Just moving now to the last question. I think we can all agree that this kind of list is very strong. The Ynnari kind of toolbox combined with the chapter traits of the craft world traits of Alaitoc create a very strong kind of toolbox effect. You also have those really strong psychic powers, the flexibility of being able to use, each kind of spell has 2 uses for the runes of battle. We know it's really strong. How should it change? So I think that there's obviously been a kind of, people have kind of said, well, that they think Ynnari are too strong, that Ynnari is still double dipping too much, that people kind of feel frustrated that Ynnari not only get to soul burst, but they get to use the stratagems unique to specific craft worlds. I actually agree with that. And my initial, people were first complaining about Ynnari, one of my initial suggestions to nerf them or curb their power was to say that when you gain the Ynnari keyword, you lose the craft world keyword. So rather, in the moment, it says that you gain it with no loss. It doesn't replace it. You just gain Ynnari. I think it should replace it. So if a Dark Reaper becomes a Ynnari Dark Reaper, it's no longer affiliated to any specific craft world. So I think that by creating that, it means that you don't get that interaction with the stratagems and things like that. And you also don't get to board, like Ynnari Reapers couldn't board an Alaitoc transport. So that nerf is would hit them very hard. It would hit some of their combos. It would also prevent you getting double dipping, getting the stratagems and alongside the Ynnari bonus. So I think that almost single-handedly would bring this list down significantly. I think that would be enough personally. So that's one way in which Ynnari should change. I think that's all that needs to happen to Ynnari. I think they were already nerfed extremely heavily with the previous FAQ to the point that you now have these kind of like single build Ynnari armies. There's no diversity anymore because everyone's just taking big units of Shining Spears and Reapers. They're not taking MSU Ynnari because MSU Ynnari just doesn't work anymore. So I feel like that nerf, the keyword just replacing rather than gaining it would be enough. But that doesn't fix Eldar on its own because there are still, it's still obvious that there's a few undercosted units in the Eldar Codex, and I think we can kind of just all agree that those units are pretty much, I'd say, just the Shining Spears and Reapers. I think Reapers, they were 36 points in the index, and they were seeing play. People were taking them, albeit they did feel a little bit chunky and a little bit expensive for that many points, but they were still seeing play. And then you flash forward to the Codex, and they go from 36 points to 27 points. That's a ridiculously heavy reduction, So you're not getting a 9-point reduction there. So they're effectively going down 25% value. And that was a big discount. So I think they could converge back or go back towards what they were before. Something like 32 points, 31 points, I think would be reasonable for a Dark Reaper. So they should certainly go up in points. Combine that with the Ynnari nerf I mentioned earlier, and they lose a lot of power. Tempest launchers could also creep up a few more points again. At the moment, they're only 5 points more than the normal missile launcher. They should probably return to being about 10 points more than they were before. And then you go to Shining Spears. Shining Spears, if you look at a Shining Spear and what that model gets instead of a Wind Rider, it's actually insane. So for 8 points more, they only pay 8 points more than a Wind Rider. They get the Laser Lance, which is worth 8 points, right? So they're effectively getting that Laser Lance. But the Laser Lance gives shooting, it gives combat, and they retain their Twin Shuriken Catapult, which gives them lots of flexibility against Horde. So they're gaining that extra combat ability, they're gaining the shooting ability. They also get a 3-up armor save instead of a 4-up armor save. So they gain +1 to their armor save. And they also get a 4-up invulnerable save to shooting that Wind Riders don't have. Which, if you cast Protect on them, they get a 3-up invulnerable save to shooting. And a 2-up armor save. So it's quite clear that Shining Spears are too strong compared to Wind Riders. And for their cost, they're just too good. They're too good in combat. They're too fast. They're too, just cheap. So I think they need to go up in points, or they need some sort of adjustment. I personally think they could probably go up a couple of points and also go back down to a 4-up armor save. I don't think that there's any logic for them to have a better armor save than Wind Riders. They effectively just are Wind Riders with kind of combat specs. So, but that might be difficult for GW to do given the fact that they don't really want to adjust unit entries. But they could. They could say, we're going to give Shining Spears a 4-up armor save and push them up from 31 points per model to about 34, 35. So that kind of change would be enough to curb the power of Shining Spears, which if you combine with the Dark Reaper nerf, I think will bring down Craftwell Loader a lot, as well as the fact that Ynnari need that keyword clarification. That certainly needs to happen. Lastly, a couple of honorable mentions. I think that there's a lot of heat, people putting a lot of heat on Wave Serpents, but I don't necessarily think Wave Serpents deserve the pressure they're getting. I think that when you look at lists that are simply just Wave Serpent heavy lists and not much else, they just die. Wave Serpents just die in combat. They are a very flexible unit, but I don't think that they require much of a nerf. I think if any form of nerf is going to go in and throw in a Wave Serpent, I think perhaps they could just go up a few points, maybe like 10 points per model, but any more than that will just kill Wave Serpents. And once Wave Serpents kind of die, then Craftwell will just become a bad codex. I think if you kind of are nerfing Reapers, nerfing Spears, nerfing Ynnari, and you nerf Serpents, and you kind of all these things are happening, it won't just kind of drop into the middle tier. I think you'll find that Eldar will just drop off totally because they'll just go back to kind of what they were in the index, which is a cluster of overcosted things that are easy to kind of manipulate due to the fact that the synergies start to get affected. But overall, thanks for watching, guys. I had a lot of fun at this year's Cancon. I think this was incredibly, interesting list to play. I had a lot of enjoyment, and I'd like to thank all my opponents. I had a lot of fun on the table. I had no disputes or no kind of really tense games. They were all really fun, and we had, my opponents and I had a lot of great time at the convention. So thanks again to the TOs of the event. Thanks to the ITC for providing us a very kind of interactive format. I think the new missions are fantastic, so props to them, kudos to them for that. And I'll see you guys next time at next CanCon and maybe at a few events in between. Cheers.